A very good evening to all of you, respected Ambuja Madam, respected judges, Anuj Sir, Hariprasad Sir, Sangeeta Madam, and Venu. And welcome all the participants who are presenting in this prestigious AKCOG President's Gold Medal. Actually, this President's Gold Medal was started in 2000, way back in 2004, by when P.K. Shekharan sir was president, and this is since then it is continuing uninterruptedly, and it is supposed to be, it is considered to be one of the prestigious medals in the competition item of AKCOG every year, and we have this year about 33 participants. And today is the first day, and we have got none other than our KFOG President Ambuja Madam for this session to judge and for monitoring, and for her presence itself is a big blessing for us. I now invite Dr. Ambuja Madam to say a few words. I welcome you once and all again to this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. Respected senior members of Kerala Federation, Secretary General Dr. Venu, and all the other office bearers of Kerala Federation, my dear participants, the coordinators, the judges, and all those who have logged in. We are kickstarting the e-AKCOG. We are organizing this on a virtual platform for the first time, and today is the first day. So with all the blessings of our God Almighty, we are starting the different prize papers today. And here we are having the President's Medal, as Dr. Reggie has already said. It is on the theme of the conference, and the theme of this conference is preventive obstetrics and gynecology. I welcome all the judges, Dr. Anuj, Dr. Sangeeta, Dr. Hariprasad, and I'm sure we are going to have a good session today. And we have a total of 8 minutes for each participant, and 6 minutes for the presentation, and 2 minutes for the interaction. And I wish all the participants the very best, and hope to have a good experience. Thank you.
Ambuja Madam, thank you very much, Ambuja Madam. On behalf of KFOG, I welcome all, Ambuja Madam, the judges, respected judges, Sangeeta Ma'am, Hariprasad Sir, Anuj Sir. Welcome to this prestigious competition, the KFOG President's Medal. Due to some unavoidable circumstances, Dr. Reggie has to be away for an hour. So I will be helping with the conduct of the session for the next hour or so. So I think we have 12 presentations today. Just like how Ambuja Madam said, I will just say that it's total 6-minute presentation followed by 2 minutes for question and answers. So what we will do is 6 minutes, you can present, in 2 minutes question and answers. At the end of 5 minutes, you will get a reminder that it's 5 minutes. And at the end of 2 minutes of discussion, the judges will be getting a reminder to say that the time for the question answer session is over. In case we are going in order, we have given all the participants order from 1 to 12. In case some participant is not able to log in or has some difficulty with connectivity, we will wait for 30 seconds to reconnect. In the 30 seconds, if the reconnection is not established, then we will consider the judges, and we will together consider to give the participant an opportunity at the end of the program to represent their papers. We will not be stopping or waiting for an indefinite period of time. We will go in the order in which we have pre-planned. So I think that we will start on time, and it's now 5:29, and yeah. So then I call upon the first participant, Dr. Amrita J. Nair, to screen share and begin her presentation. Dr. Amrita, please unmute yourself. Yes, your screen is visible. Slideshow. Slideshow, yeah. Please.
Good evening, all. My topic is a comparative study on cesarean rate, indications, and post-operative morbidity in COVID-19 positive and non-COVID pregnant women. COVID-19 pandemic has been considered as the biggest global health crisis in the century. Pregnancy being an immune-compromised state makes it more vulnerable for COVID-19 infection. Many literatures concerning pregnancy with COVID-19 infection from different countries have been reported, describing their clinical features, potential risk for medical comorbidities, and maternal and neonatal outcome. Pregnant women and neonates require a special attention during this pandemic. There is lack of good quality data to draw unbiased conclusion with regard to severity of maternal infection, specific complications of COVID-19 in pregnancy, vertical transmission, as well as perinatal and neonatal complications. Although COVID-19 is not recommended as a sole indication for cesarean section, the rates of cesarean in women with COVID-19 infection are higher than general population. Hence, we decided to conduct a study to identify the cesarean rate, indication for cesarean section in COVID-19 and non-COVID pregnant women, to determine the risk factors and post-operative complications. Also, to evaluate the immediate neonatal outcomes. The study was conducted in a tertiary care center and teaching hospital from August 2020 to Jan 2021. It was a retrospective comparative study. Study population included all women who had cesarean delivery during the study period were grouped into two, and group 1 included all COVID-19 positive women and group 2 comprised non-COVID pregnant women. Demographic and clinical data details were collected from the records. Maternal risk factors, indications for cesarean delivery, and maternal morbidity were studied. In COVID-19 group, diagnostic testing and treatment were as per Health and Family Welfare Guidelines. Complications after cesarean like postpartum hemorrhage, sepsis, wound infection, pneumonia, stillbirth, need for NICU admissions were studied. And the data collected were statistically analyzed using chi-square test to determine the p-value. Coming to the results, total number of deliveries during the study period was 4,288. In COVID-19 positive group, out of 419 deliveries, 199 were by cesarean section, 47%. In non-COVID group, out of 3,869 deliveries, 1,969 were by cesarean section. When statistically analyzed, it showed that there is no statistically significant increase in number of cesarean deliveries in COVID positive group. This is the age distribution. Majority of the patients belong to 24 to 29. Associated comorbidities, 51.27% in COVID-19 and 56% in non-COVID group had some of the other risk factors. Among them, diabetes was the most common risk factor. Most of the cesarean section were by emergency cesarean. In elective CS, in COVID-19 group, 49.25 were elective cesarean, and in non-COVID group, it was only 39.7, probably due to low threshold of cesarean in COVID group. Indications for emergency cesarean, most of the indications were fetal distress in both the groups. These included cases like meconium-stained amniotic fluid, maternal pyrexia, cord prolapse, abductio placenta. There were 2 cases of COVID-19 pneumonia diagnosed antenatally, where cesarean delivery was conducted early without any obstetric indication. Post-operative morbidity, 6.5% of patients in COVID-19 group, 1.8% of patients in non-COVID group had post-operative morbidity. This was statistically analyzed, and it showed that there is statistically significant increase in post-operative morbidity among COVID positive group. There were 3 cases of maternal near miss in COVID-19 and 5 cases of maternal near miss in non-COVID group. 0.9% of babies born to COVID positive mothers required NICU admission.
1 minute more, please.
And 0.06% in non-COVID required NICU admission. This is not statistically significant. Conclusion, cesarean delivery rate in COVID-19 positive group was 47% and in non-COVID group was 50.87%. This was comparable and showed no significant increase in COVID-19 group. The indications for cesarean delivery in COVID group were mostly obstetric indications. The post-operative morbidity in COVID-19 was 6.5%, whereas in non-COVID it was 1.8%, showed a statistically significant increase in post-operative morbidity in COVID-19 positive patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amrita. I request the judges to go ahead with their questions 2 minutes from now.
Dr. Amrita, could you tell me, most of the centers have recorded high cesarean section rates in COVID group. However, in your center, you had it as a comparable with the non-COVID group.
Yes,
what
sir.
do you think the reason was for that? Do you have any idea why it could have occurred that way?
Sir, in my hospital is a tertiary care center where most of the referred cases in non-COVID, we had many referred cases in them, and in periphery, there were the normal delivery cases were more in the peripheries, and majority of the cesarean cases were to our center. So we had more number of cesarean cases in the non-COVID group, and it became comparable to the COVID group.
So your two populations were not matched.
Yeah.
There was a skewed deviation.
Yes, madam. But
Did you
age-wise,
is this an analysis of primary cesarean or all your cesareans?
all cesarean. All
Just
cesarean.
separate the primary section and the repeat section.
Yes, sir.
What was your
I
percentage?
have not included that.
Yeah, your repeat cesarean. You should exclude your repeat cesarean sections in both the groups.
Yes.
Your validity will be much more.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
And there's no harm in saying also that the population selection was a little skewed because
Actually, you have the numbers to do that. You could have
yeah, correct. You have
look
the
at only
numbers.
primary cesarean section rates. That would,
Absolutely.
Yes.
You're talking 4,000 deliveries
have
is a
the
large
numbers.
number.
Yes, ma'am.
Are we done with the questions, judges?
Postpartum complications, what was your commonest complication? There was hardly any sepsis, but what was your
Yes.
common in the COVID?
In the COVID group, ma'am, it was pneumonia. We had 4 cases. In those 4 cases, 2 patients already antenatally were diagnosed, and 2 other cases,
Increased PPH.
ma'am.
No postpartum hemorrhage.
No, the percentage were similar in both the.
Okay.
okay, fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Judges, if the question answer is over, I request Dr. Amrita to please stop your screen sharing.
Yeah, we
Thank you, ma'am.
Screen sharing on the stop, Yama. Right. Thank you. Now we'll go to the next presenter, Dr. Angela Babu. Are you here? Dr.
Yes,
Angela
sir.
Babu? Yes. Yeah.
I'm here. Yes.
Yeah. Please
Yes, sir.
start your presentation.
Can I start, sir?
Yes, please do.
Good evening, judges. Myself, Dr. Angela Babu, junior resident from Trivandrum Medical College. The title of my paper presentation is Pubertal Growth in Type 1 Diabetic Girls in a Tertiary Care Center. And my study was guided. And my study was guided by Dr. Jayashree Vivaman and Dr. Riaz Aisa from the Department of OBG and Department of Pediatrics, Trivandrum Medical College. Background and national. The Diabetes Atlas 2017 estimates there are 128,500 children and adolescents with diabetes in India. Worldwide, India ranks first in countries of the world for the number of incident cases. Type 1 diabetes mellitus in children is known to adversely affect the pubertal growth and development in them. Even though severe forms of growth and pubertal delay are now very rare because of major advances in the treatment of type 1 diabetes, some degrees of delay in growth and pubertal development are still noted in recent studies. Studies show menstrual irregularities are common in type 1 diabetic children, which are risk factors for developing fertility issues and cardiovascular as well as microvascular complications in future life. Type 1 diabetes and its effect on growth, puberty, ovarian function, and reproduction has been extensively studied in many countries, but very few studies have been done in India. With a growing population of type 1 diabetic children and a majority of them with pre-pubertal onset of diabetes in our country, such a study becomes all the more relevant. By studying the pattern of pubertal growth and menstrual abnormalities in these children, we can modify our clinical approach and follow-up and treatment strategies so as to alleviate the anxiety related to pubertal anomalies and also to prevent the long-term complications of the same. Coming to the objective, my primary objective was to compare the mean age of menarche in girls with type 1 diabetes mellitus and girls without type 1 diabetes mellitus. Secondary objectives include to compare the mean age of different TANF stages of breast and pubic hair development in girls with and without type 1 diabetes mellitus. And other objectives were to study the relationship between menarche and the following parameters: BMI, HbA1c level, duration of type 1 diabetes mellitus, daily insulin requirements, and to study the menstrual disorders in type 1 diabetic girls. Study design was a comparative cross-sectional study done over a period of 1 year. The study setting was Pediatric and Adolescent Diabetic Clinic in Department of Pediatrics in Trivandrum Medical College for the cases, and outpatient Department of Pediatrics and Obstetric and Gynecology and General Medicine, Trivandrum Medical College. Sample size was collected by from a study by Lombardo et al. Menarcheal timing in intensively treated girls with type 1 diabetes mellitus, and the sample size was 13 each group, so total sample size 60. Sampling method: every consecutive cases fulfilling the inclusion criteria and attending the above said OPDs were collected till the sample size was obtained. For controls also likewise, consecutive sampling was done. Inclusion criteria include girls with type 1 diabetes attending the pediatric and adolescent diabetic clinic belonging to the age group 8 to 16 years. Exclusion criteria: girls or parents not willing to participate, and girls with associated symptoms leading to precocious or delayed puberty. Study variables include age at menarche, TANF stages of breast and pubic hair development, BMI, duration of disease, daily insulin requirement, HbA1c level, and menstrual disorders. Coming to the result, I studied a total of 35 cases and 35 controls. Out of 35 cases, 18 had attained menstruation, and out of controls, 21 had attained menarche. The mean age of menarche in cases was 12.82 years, and those in control were 11.76 years. It was a delay of 1 year, and it was statistically significant. Coming to the mean age in each TANF stages of breast development, there was a delay in each TANF stage of breast development among the cases, but the delay was not significantly statistically significant except in TANF stage 2 of breast development. Coming to the mean age in each TANF stage of pubic hair development, here also there was a delay in the development of TANF stages among the cases, but it was not statistically significant other than for TANF stage 4. Coming to height, weight, and BMI comparison, the mean height was comparable between the case and control among all age groups. Mean weight was comparable in all age groups except for in the age group 12 to 14 years, where there was significant decrease in the mean weight, that is 39.1 kg versus 53.3 kg among with cases versus control. Coming to mean BMI also, here also we see other than the age group 12 to 14 years, there was no statistically significant difference in the mean BMI between these two groups. Coming to the correlation of menarche with different parameters like duration of disease, HbA1c, insulin dose, and BMI, I did not get any statistically significant correlation among these. Coming to the comparison of menstrual abnormalities, 44.4% of the cases had irregular menstrual period compared to only 14.3% of the control group, and this was statistically significant. Coming to the other menstrual abnormalities like heavy menstrual bleeding and infrequent menstrual bleeding, etc. 38.9% of the cases had infrequent menstrual bleeding compared to only 4.8% of the controls, and 22.2% of the cases had heavy menstrual bleeding compared to only 14.3%, and this difference was statistically significant. Conclusion: despite intensive insulin treatment, pubertal growth is still delayed in type 1 diabetic children. Menarche is delayed by a year in our study. There's also significant delay in certain stages of breast and pubic hair development, but the final sexual maturity is not delayed. Despite these delays reported, all values fall within the normal ranges for pubertal development. Severe delay in pubertal growth was not observed in our study and is rare these days according to other published studies. Type 1 diabetes girls are at more risk to develop menstrual abnormalities during the adolescent period when compared to their general population. All the above findings point to the importance of close monitoring of the pubertal growth in the diabetic children and also the need to address abnormalities at the right time. This will help to alleviate the stress associated with these abnormalities and also help in preventing the microvascular and cardiovascular complication and fertility issues in the future. recommendation, a prospective or retrospective study longitudinal follow subjects is recommended for more clear problems related to the pubertal development on these children. Regular follow pubertal development and growth in these children is very important, and proper education to the parents regarding the chance of delayed puberty and menstrual abnormalities is very important.
2 minutes for question and answers, please, judges.
Okay. Dr. Angela, what do you think is the basis for this? You have postulated a delay in the pubertal growth and also
Yes.
the menstrual abnormalities. What do you think is the basis for it? You haven't mentioned it in your rationale. What do you think is causing the delay?
Causing the in type 1 diabetes, it's like hypogonadot hypothalamic functional hypothalamic dysfunction in type 1 diabetes. The menstrual abnormalities and the delay is mainly due to the following factors. One is in present days, it is mainly more due to the insulin excess than due to the insulin deficiency, which was found in previous olden times. Now, due to exogenous insulin, even exogenous insulin will go and bind the insulin like growth factor, IGF-1 receptors, and insulin receptors in the ovary, and they themselves will cause abnormal folliculogenesis, steroidogenesis in these children. And even if these are not under well control due to hypoinsulinemia, insulin deficiency will cause decreased gonadotropic secretion due to decrease in leptin, kisspeptin, dopamine, and catecholamines, and also due to hyperglycemia itself can affect the folliculogenesis and cause insulin resistance and hyperandrogenism in these children.
So in your basis, it's probably the insulin levels, the glycemic control, all these things probably will play a part in your basis for this study. But in your study, have you looked at the sugar values? The
Yes, HbA1c values have checked, sir. Almost all of them had uncontrolled HbA1c values. The mean HbA1c value was 9.96%. And all the least HbA1c value among the case group which I got was 7.4%, and I got as high as 13% also, sir.
Similarly, how long these patients were on insulin, all these things would make a difference in
duration of, I also checked the duration of disease, sir. That also had a very wide range. Some were just recently detected, it's 1 month back, and some were on insulin since last 14 years, sir.
So it will make a difference, you know. So in a child who's had insulin right from the very beginning, and a child who's been having uncontrolled sugars for a couple of years and diagnosed recently. So that, I think in your study added that also a part of your insulin levels and your insulin, the glycemic control should have been part of your study to compare between the groups and also within the group of those who are having diabetes, type 1 diabetes.
I did not get any association between menarche and all these HbA1c level, duration of disease. In my I have looked, sir. I have presented. I have looked, sir.
Did you get any correlation between BMI and?
No, madam. I did not get, madam. I did not get any correlation, madam.
How old was your youngest participant in the study?
I took between the age group 8 to 16 years, madam. I got 8 to 16 years.
So portion of yours have not attained menarche as well?
Yes, madam. So, out of 35, only 18 has attained menarche. But that's because I have included from 8 to 16 years.
Exactly. So your menstrual abnormalities, the power comes down because your numbers are also
reduced, madam.
Judges, I wish to remind you of the time.
Yeah, very interesting. I think you should do it for a longer period of time.
Yes, madam. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, judges.
Dr. Angela, can you please stop your screen share?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I now request without delay, Dr. Anjana JS. Dr. Anjana? Dr. Anjana?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Please start your presentation.
Respected teachers, I'll be presenting on the accuracy of colposcopy-directed cervical biopsy in women with cytological high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions. We know that cervical cancer is a potentially preventable disease due to its long pre-invasive stage. And in developed countries, incidence of cervical cancer is very low. But in developing countries like India, the burden of disease is still high. And colposcopy-directed biopsy is a cornerstone method for diagnosis of cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. We know that currently they advocate HPV-based screening for cervical lesion. But in developing countries where HPV-based screening is not at so much in prevalence, the colposcopy directed by the three-step screening, that is cytology followed by colposcopic biopsy followed by conization, still plays an important role in diagnosing and managing cervical pre-invasive disease. And so the aim of this disease was to investigate the diagnostic accuracy of colposcopy-directed cervical biopsy in women who underwent loop electrosurgical excision procedure for high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions. This was a retrospective audit of patients who underwent LEAP at our institute from January 2014 to December 2020. The data was summarized using appropriate descriptive statistics. And keeping the LEAP, final LEAP biopsy as a gold standard, the diagnostic accuracy of colposcopy biopsy in assessing and diagnosing the lesions were assessed and compared using exact McNemo's test. We included a total of 141 patients who underwent LEAP for HSIL cytology during this time period. The mean age of the patient were 48.3 years and 57.8% patients were premenopausal. And the final LEAP histology showed high-grade lesion in 81.5% patients. Then we compared the histopathology reports between cervical biopsy and LEAP histopathology, and it was seen that in 9.9% patients, both LEAP biopsy and LEAP HPR showed low-grade reports, and while in 78.7% patients, both the LEAP biopsy and LEAP histopathology showed high-grade lesion. In 4 patients, it was seen that low-grade lesion was seen in cervical biopsy, but high-grade lesions were finally found in the LEAP HPR. And in 12 patients, the cervical biopsy showed high-grade lesion and final HPR came as low-grade lesion. So when we compared the biopsy and LEAP report, the overall concordance rate of 88.6% was found, with an underdiagnosis of 2.8% and an overdiagnosis of 8.5%. So we assessed the diagnostic performance of cervical biopsy compared to LEAP, and it was seen that the cervical biopsy had a sensitivity of 90%, specificity of 78%, positive predictive value of 97%, and an accuracy of 89% in detecting cervical premalignant lesion. And when we compared both the reports using McNemo's test, there was no significant discrepancy between the cervical biopsy and LEAP HPR report, and we can assume that cervical biopsy is a very important, gives us important decision making report to decide for further treatment. So coming to the discussion, the reported accuracy of colposcopy direct biopsy varies between 60 to 95% for HSIL cytology in various studies. And in one study by Stoops et al., among 641 colposcopic patients, the accuracy of biopsy was 88%, and better detection was seen in young women, and it did not depend upon the expertise of the patient. And in another meta-analysis of around 70,000 patients, the accuracy rate of for HSIL cytology for colposcopy biopsy is around 91%. But there are studies which shows lower concordance, like the study by Kim et al., which showed only a concordance of around 67%. And our study showed a concordance of around 90%. And this was done in 141 patients. But it was seen that in our report, cervical biopsy had high-grade lesion in 8.5% patients, and the final report showed low-grade lesion in the LEAP HPR. And this might be because the high-grade lesion might have been completely removed at the time of the punch biopsy, or it could have undergone spontaneous regression, or it could have been destroyed by the post-biopsy inflammation. So concluding, with a sensitivity of 90% in patients with high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions of the cervix, colposcopy direct biopsy plays an important role in the early detection and management of cervical precancers. And these are my references. Thank you.
So Anjana, from your study, what inference are you getting? How are you going to suggest this to the, or extrapolate this to the local population if you are the planner What do you want to do with this study of yours?
So for further decision making, it is very important, sir. Whether we can go, whether we should go for an excisional biopsy or an that is excisional procedure, or we can go for an ablative procedure. We can be very sure in HSIL cytology patient, the cervical biopsy is showing a low grade lesion. We can be almost very sure that it should be a low grade lesion, and we can go for a destructive ablative procedure for such patient. And if the report is coming as like an CIN3, or we can be more sure, and what we can decide about the further management, sir, whether it should be excisional or ablation.
You haven't mentioned about your colposcopy findings in your study. You
Yes,
only
sir.
mentioned about only the biopsy part. So
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Actually, we go. Yes, sir.
Adequacy of your colposcopy should be also more relevant here, because what could you miss in this when you're doing this? Suppose you're only planning an excisional procedure, so what could you miss?
Sir, the colposcopy should be adequate. I didn't mention, sir.
Yeah,
And what, sir?
endocervical component. You could miss an endocervical component.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Type C transformation zone we should be seeing.
Yeah. So, I mean, in your whole study, you have not mentioned anywhere about your colposcopy findings.
Yes, sir.
That's why I asked. Okay.
In what kind of a woman would you miss this endocervical changes, Anjana?
Madam, postmenopausal women or women with type 3 transformation zone, we are, and the patients having endocervical adenocarcinoma, we will be missing more lesions, ma'am. So
So at the end of your study, what would you recommend to the practicing gynecologist? Is it okay to first screen with the pap smear and then to colposcopy? What would be your recommendation?
Ma'am,
when should I go to definitely a colposcopy?
Ma'am, here for large scale screening, better to go for smear, ma'am. Okay. And if the smear is showing ascus lesion, or if it is coming as HSIL and even LSIL, we should go for a colposcopy, ma'am.
So an LSIL also requires a
yeah, ma'am. Yes. If we should go for colposcopy. Currently, it is recommended to go for colposcopy for LSIL also. Ascus, we can triage with HPV test if it is available, ma'am. Or we can repeat the cytology after 6 months to 1 year. But and if it is repeatedly coming as ascus, then we need to go for colposcopy. LSIL, we have to go for colposcopy. And ascus HSIL, we have to go for colposcopy.
For a pilocytic atypia?
It just shows it is just an HPV related change, ma'am. We can follow up the patient with the repeated smears. And persistent, if it is persistent, then maybe we can go for colposcopy.
So when you type the HPV, when do you type the HPV?
Ma'am, actually, ascus, we can type the HPV, and if it is coming as 16 or 18, then we can go directly for a colposcopy, ma'am. And if it is HPV negative, or if it is low risk, we can still follow up the patient for ascus. LSIL, it is direct colposcopy.
It's also important in order to figure out which one will definitely need a colposcopy.
Thank you, judges, and thank you for the presentation. Dr. Anjana, can you please stop your screen share?
Yes, sir.
Sir.
Yeah, please start your presentation.
Good evening, all. My topic is.
Okay, now we are able to see.
Correct. Right.
My topic is health-related quality of life after natural and surgical menopause, a comparative study. Introduction. Menopause is the time in woman's life when menstrual period stops permanently. The transition through menopause is a life event that profoundly affects the quality of life. Surgical menopause is associated with the sudden and complete loss of all ovarian steroids. Estrogen deficiency, whether arising from surgical or natural menopause, can have both medical and psychological adverse consequences for a woman's health and well-being. It is her health-related quality of life. Sir, I am not able to proceed.
Why the problem will be on your computer, no?
You're not able to move the slides, Amrita?
Yeah, correct.
Objective to compare the health-related quality of life of women at surgical menopause with that of women at natural menopause, utilizing the menopause rating scale 2. Methods. The study was conducted in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology in a government medical college from 2018 to 2019. A cross-sectional study was carried out among women in the age group 45 to 55 years with either natural or surgical menopause. Patients who have undergone bilateral salpingo oophorectomy during previous 1 year and who have completed 1 year of surgical menopause were identified from records and were called back for follow-up. The other group of subjects were female bystanders of patients admitted in the wards who were between 45 to 55 years and have amenorrhea for 1 year. Subjects in each group were studied and information regarding socio-demographic profile and reproductive parameters were recorded. The severity of menopausal symptoms and its impact on health-related quality of life was compared between 100 women at surgical menopause with that of 100 women at natural menopause. For measurement of health-related quality of life, menopause rating scale 2 was used. It is a 11-item questionnaire comprising 3 independent dimensions: psychological, somato-vegetative, and urogenital subscale. The psychological symptoms include 4, that is depressed, irritable, anxious, or exhausted mood. Somato-vegetative symptoms include 4, that is sweating or flush, cardiac complaints, disorders, joint and muscle complaints. Urogenital symptoms include 3, that is sexual problems, urinary complaints, and vaginal dryness. It was the menopause rating scale included 11 symptoms from 3 domains. And these are the observations. The age at menopause was comparable between the natural and surgical menopause groups, and education is also comparable. Then occupational status also comparable, and marital status, parity, and BMI. These are all comparable between the two groups. The comparison of different domain between the two groups. First one is psychological domain. The mean psychological domain was higher in surgical menopause group, and the p-value was less than 0.05. That was significant. And in case of somato-vegetative domain also, p-value was less than 0.05. That was significant. And in case of urogenital domain, the p-value was 0.001. That was also less than 0.05, and it is significant. The total MRS score, which was the sum of 3 domains, was also higher in the surgical menopause group than the natural menopause group, and the p-value was significant. And also compare the association of total MRS score and other variables such as age at menopause, education, occupation, marital status, parity, and BMI. Except in case of BMI, the p-value was not significant. So coming to discussion, there was a significant difference in total MRS score and each domain score between the two groups. The total MRS score were much higher for the surgical menopause group than for the natural menopause group, and this difference was significant. Similar results were obtained on the 3 subscales: somato-vegetative, psychological, and urogenital. This shows that health-related quality of life is more affected after surgical menopause than natural menopause. Conclusion: health-related quality of life was found to be worse after surgical menopause than natural menopause. Women who had surgical menopause is experiencing more and severe symptoms. So it is recommended that the decision regarding elective oophorectomy at the time of hysterectomy for benign conditions should be made with caution. Thank you.
I request judges for question and answers.
What are the main causes for oophorectomy, bilateral oophorectomy?
It is usually performed for estrogen-dependent conditions like endometriosis, and also it is performed prophylactically at the time of hysterectomy for prevention of further development of ovarian carcinoma.
Prophylactic hysterectomy is the any history of cancer in their family, or
Yes, it is usually performed if there is a history of any family history of breast cancer or ovarian cancer.
Yes.
So suppose you were doing a hysterectomy for a woman, at what age and beyond would you consider doing a prophylactic oophorectomy, irrespective of family history? You said it's better to avoid surgical menopause. So,
Yes, madam.
so in your center, at what age and beyond do you say, okay, now let me take off the ovaries?
After the age of 55.
55.
Yes,
Very good.
madam.
And what is this RRSO? You just said it. Risk reducing?
Salpingo oophorectomy, risk reducing salpingo oophorectomy.
So what kind of women would you do that for? Irrespective of how old they are, you probably will do it very early. At what age do you do an RRSO?
The age of 35.
Okay, and for whom do you do it?
In those with the family history of BRCA1 gene mutation, HNBCC syndrome.
Okay. And this, when you compared the vasomotor symptoms, did you think of looking at bone loss and pains? And you looked at a lot of vasoactive phenomena, but did you look at any bone loss, or did you do any tests, or did you look for pains? Did you do any X-rays?
No, madam, we just analyzed the history of bone and joint pain only.
That was significant in the two?
Yes, madam.
So even 1 year after surgical menopause, they had more joint pains than the
natural menopause group, madam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anumol. Thank you, judges. I think, Dr. Anu, you please stop screen sharing.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Now we'll move ahead to Dr. Anupama Nair. Dr. Anupama, apologies for missed them earlier. All the best.
Thank you, sir.
Please share screen. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Sir, am I audible?
Slideshow.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My title of the title is Maternal and Fetal Outcome of Autoimmune Disorders Complicating Pregnancy. Myself, Dr. Anupama S. Nair, Junior Resident, Government Medical College, Trivandrum. My guide was Dr. Shaila, Professor, Department of Gynecology. Background. Autoimmune disorders are chronic multisystem disorders predominantly affecting females of childbearing age. With improvements in diagnostic and treatment modalities, the survival and quality of life of these patients have been improving. Hence, pregnancy is becoming common among patients with autoimmune disorders. The outcome of pregnancy can be affected by the presence of autoimmune disease and vice versa. The rate of stillbirth, fetal growth restriction, preeclampsia, preterm delivery are higher in such patients than in normal pregnancies. Now, autoimmune disorders can be separated into organ-restricted diseases and systemic ones. The damage of single organs produced by antibodies focused against specific cellular antigens characterizes the first group of disease, such as autoimmune thyroiditis, whereas the latter are produced by a systemic inflammatory response initiated by inappropriate and excess immune activation that leads to immune complex formation and deposition into sensitive tissues. The primary objective was to study the maternal and fetal outcome of pregnancies complicated with autoimmune disorders in Tertiary Care Center, Trivandrum. It was a prospective observational study done in the antenatal OPD wards and labor room of SAT Hospital, Trivandrum. Study population included all patients diagnosed with any of the following systemic autoimmune disorders were previously diagnosed using widely used criteria. The diseases included were SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, primary antiphospholipid syndrome, systemic vasculitis, Sjogren's syndrome, Wegener's granulomatosis. Sample size was 245 calculated using formula 4PQ by D square. The P was prevalence of spontaneous abortion in autoimmune disorders. This was obtained from a study published in 2015. Now, the data collection was done with the help of semi-structured questionnaire. Each patient was interviewed at the first contact with our hospital. Now, and the patients were followed up throughout their pregnancy to study the maternal and fetal outcome. Study variables were age and antenatal period, whether it was spontaneous conception or there is a history of any infertility treatment, disease flare or relapse, hypertensive disorders, hematological abnormalities like anemia or thrombocytopenia, abruptio placenta, and intrapartum mode of delivery, whether the delivery was term or preterm, meconium stained amniotic fluid, postpartum period, whether there was a DVT, a postpartum hemorrhage, infections, and fetal variables were a spontaneous abortion, fetal growth restriction, birth weight, and stillbirth. Results and observation, we included a total of 250 patients for the final analysis, and majority of the patients were between 21 to 30 years of age, and with 43.2% in the age group 26 to 30. 13.2% were primary gravidae, whereas 10.8% were on their fourth or higher number of pregnancies, although the number of previous viable pregnancies were not considered here. The type of autoimmune disorders, 149 cases, that is 59.6% patients were of SLE, 30.8% primary APS, 6.4% rheumatoid arthritis, 2.8% Sjogren's syndrome, and there was one case of systemic vasculitis. 66.8% patients were diagnosed to have autoimmune disorders during or after a previous pregnancy. 13.6% patients were diagnosed during a present pregnancy, whereas 16.4% had pre-existing disease. The 90.8% patients had spontaneous conception, where remaining 9.2% were treated for infertility and had induced conception. 98.4% had regular antenatal visits. 20 patients had disease flare or relapse during the present pregnancy. 107 patients at 42.8% had hypertensive disorders in the present pregnancy, out of which gestational hypertension was the most common, 24.4%. 9.2% had chronic hypertension. Hematological abnormalities, we found 6% patients with anemia, whereas 18% patients had thrombocytopenia during this present pregnancy. When 10 patients at 4% had abruptio placenta during the pregnancy. Outcome, out of the 250 women, 52 had spontaneous abortion, 9 women had stillbirth or IUD, and 189 patients had live birth. Out of the 52 abortions, the term births, 74.2% were term births and 25.8% were preterm births. 56.6% delivered vaginally, whereas 86% delivered by LSCS. 86 CS, 64 patients had emergency CS, and 22% women had elective CS. Postpartum complications, 3.6% had postpartum hemorrhage, 6% had infections. Infections included respiratory tract infections and UTI. Only 2 patients had DVT. Coming to fetal outcome variables, 27 patients born alive had fetal growth restrictions, and 17.9 babies were preterm. 63.1% babies born alive had birth weight between 2.6 and 3 kg. 33% patient had babies were less than 2.5 kg. Intrapartum complications, 10.2% babies born alive had fetal distress, 8.4% had meconium stained amniotic fluid, 1.5% had anomalies.
One more minute.
23% had babies were admitted in an ICU. Concluding, high frequency of gestational and perinatal complications such as hypertensive disorders, stillbirth, spontaneous abortions, preterm birth, and fetal growth restrictions were seen in our study. All the pregnancies with autoimmune disorders should be considered as high risk, and they need pre-pregnancy counseling, risk assessment, a multidisciplinary approach, a tailored antenatal and postnatal management plans, experienced high-level neonatal unit, and early recognition of flares and complications. These are essential cornerstones for optimizing the chance of successful outcomes for both mother and fetus. Thank you.
Judges for discussion, please.
Anupama, did you study the neonatal, the nursery care? Because all these autoimmune disorders have a large percentage of them have problems in the baby as well. ROLA.
Yes, madam. It was not studied because we couldn't get permission from the Department of Pediatrics for that, because our time period was short and we couldn't study the neonatal outcome.
But did you do ROLA and all those autoantibodies?
No, madam, it was not done for our patients.
And you said you had 4 patients of rheumatoid arthritis. How did they fare in pregnancy? They should have done quite well.
Yes, madam. All patients fared well.
Why?
They did not have any flare.
No. Why? Why is it that rheumatoid arthritis fares well?
Rheumatoid arthritis patients are known to have the incidence of flare is very less in rheumatoid arthritis.
They don't have flares. Why? Okay, you had 2 DVTs.
Yes, madam.
Were they with heparin?
No, madam, they were not with heparin.
In which kind of patients did you have those DVTs?
Madam, they were the primary APS patients.
Primary APS, and you did not have.
Madam, they were not given heparin, madam. Madam, these patients presented in the immediate postnatal period with the DVT.
Yeah, but primary APS, how did you diagnose that primary APS? You knew they were primary APS when they
Madam, after coming to our hospital only, they were diagnosed with primary APS.
Yeah, so before delivery, they had a diagnosis.
No, madam. Before delivery, it was diagnosed during this pregnancy, like postpartum period.
Oh, after they developed the DVT,
yes,
you found them positive.
Yes.
How many of your patients were on heparin?
Sir, most of the patients were on heparin before. The patients who were diagnosed in the previous pregnancy were on heparin and icosapent during this pregnancy. Those who were diagnosed in this pregnancy were started on heparin as soon as it was diagnosed.
And do you have data how many of those on heparin had a poor outcome? Or have you looked at?
No, sir, that was not looked at.
I mean, anyhow, you're collecting the data. That was an important thing which you could have got information from your study.
Thank you very much, judges. Thank you, Dr. Anupama. Can you please stop your screen share?
Yes.
Dr. Biamol, are you here? Dr. Biamol?
Yes, sir.
Yes, are you ready with your presentation?
Yes, sir.
Judges, please note, we will have technical person helping Archana. Meanwhile, Dr. Biamol, who is next in the order, will present. Dr. Biamol, please share your screen.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, Biamol, your screen has come, correct. Slideshow, please. Slideshow, adalla. One more angeparthe. Yes, correct, that one. Correct. Please go ahead.
Respected faculty, my paper is on maternal and perinatal outcome in elective versus emergency cesarean section and observational study. Now, we know cesarean section is the most commonly performed surgical procedure in obstetrics all over the world. As per the latest data, the cesarean section at population level in India is 17.2%, and in Kerala, the incidence is alarmingly high at 35.8%. Cesarean section can be elective or emergency in nature. Elective sections are done at a pre-arranged time and ensure better teamwork, while emergency sections are performed for unforeseen or acute obstetric emergencies. The complications are usually less in case of elective sections, as we know, and this study was therefore undertaken to reiterate this fact by comparing the maternal and perinatal outcome in elective and emergency cesarean section in our hospital. Now, the primary objective was to study and compare the maternal outcome intraoperatively and postoperatively in patients undergoing elective and emergency section, and the secondary objectives were to study and compare perinatal outcomes in the newborns of these patients and to compare in terms of Robson's 10 group classification system these patients undergoing elective and emergency section. The study setting was Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Cosmopolitan Hospital, Trivandrum, and the population included all women who were delivered by cesarean section satisfying the inclusion criteria and their newborns at Cosmopolitan Hospital. This was an observational analytical study and the duration was 1 year from July 2019 to July 2020. The sample size was calculated using this formula and we got a sample size of 264 with 132 patients in each group. Now, the inclusion criteria included all the singleton term mothers, irrespective of their parity status or associated medical problems, who were delivered by lower segment cesarean section and the newborns born during the study period. The exclusion criteria included multiple pregnancy, previous classical cesarean section, and preterm cesarean section. The independent variables analyzed were age, education, occupation, socioeconomic status, obstetric score, gestational age, Robson's group, presence of any antenatal comorbidities, and indication for section. The maternal outcome was studied in terms of intraoperative complications, which include primary PPH, bowel or bladder injury, and extension of uterine incision. The postoperative complications studied were fever, urinary tract infection, wound infection, respiratory infection, headache, and secondary PPH. The perinatal outcome studied was Apgar score at 1 minute and 5 minutes, NICU admission, respiratory distress at birth, meconium aspiration syndrome, hyperbilirubinemia, and sepsis. The data analysis was done using SPSS version 16. The continuous data were compared using t-test and chi-square test, and a p-value less than 0.05 was taken statistically significant. Now, coming to the results and observations, first we compared the age of the subjects in the two groups and found that the mean age of the subjects who underwent elective section was more than that in the emergency group. 30.02 years in elective and 27.01 in emergency, and this was statistically significant. We also compared the distribution of age in the two groups and found 51.5% of the subjects in elective group were more than 30 years and only 16.7% in the emergency group were more than 30 years. None of the subjects in the elective group and 2.3% in the emergency group were less than 19 years. When they were compared on the basis of BMI, the mean BMI in the elective group was slightly more than that in the emergency group, 26.7 and 25.1 respectively, but this was not statistically significant. Now, comparison based on the obstetric score, in elective CS group, 69.7% were multipara and 30.3% were primipara, while this was reversed in the case of emergency section, where 74.2% were primi and 25.8% were multipara. This was significant statistically, and this was probably because most of the elective sections were done on previous section cases. Now, comparison of the gestational age, none of the elective CS were done after 40 weeks. 18.2% of the emergency sections were done after 40 weeks. Most of the emergency sections were done between 39 and 40 weeks, and most of the elective sections done between 38 and 38 weeks, 6 days. Now, when they were compared on the basis of Robson 10 group classification system, we found that subjects belonging to Robson group 2 had more chance of undergoing an emergency section, and subjects in group 5 were delivered mostly by an elective section. Now, comparing the intraoperative complications, the complication rate was more in emergency section with primary PPH as the statistically significant intraoperative complication. When the postoperative complications were compared, this was also more in the emergency group, with postoperative fever being the statistically significant complication identified. Now, when the perinatal complications were compared, this was also more in the emergency group, with neonatal sepsis being the statistically significant complication identified. Now, to conclude, elective sections are associated with less maternal morbidity compared to emergency section. The rate of intraoperative complications were more with emergency CS, with primary PPH being statistically significant, and the overall postoperative complication rate were more in the emergency group, with postoperative fever being the statistically significant. Also, the perinatal morbidity is more in emergency group, with sepsis, which was the statistically significant complication identified. Subjects belonging to Robson group 2 underwent emergency cesarean section more as an emergency procedure, and those in group 5 as an elective procedure. So the clinical implications of the study is an overall reduction in cesarean section rate, whether it is elective or emergency, should be the first step in reduction of complications due to the procedure. Proper selection of cases for induction and choosing the appropriate method depending on the Bishop score can reduce the cesarean rates in Robson group 2. Timely decision and considerable care during emergency cesarean sections can decrease the rate of maternal and perinatal complications. Thank you.
Thank you. Request the judges for the discussion questions.
Doctor, what was your antibiotic policy for both the groups? Was it the same?
Antibiotic policy was different for the different units in our hospital.
No, among the elective and the emergency. So you're trying to say that most
The
patients
antibiotic was
had,
same.
different.
No, same.
Same.
Uh,
Antibiotic was same. And was
In
it
the
only?
hospital, we have 3 different units. The antibiotic policy is different in 3 units, but there is no differentiation between emergent antibiotic policy in the emergency and elective group.
Okay. So are you continuing you're using only prophylactic antibiotic, or are you continuing the antibiotic after your?
We continue oral antibiotics for 3 more days after the initial dose.
Okay. But it's same for both the groups. It
It
was
is
same for the.
same for both the groups.
Okay.
And your medical disorders were not the same, isn't it? So you took some with medical disorders and some without as well.
Antenatal complication, both in emergency and elective group, patients had antenatal complications. I studied the antenatal complications, but this was not statistically significant between the groups, so I didn't include it in the slide.
Thank you very much, Dr. Biamol. Thank you very much to the judges. And please stop your screen share. Judges, we'll go back to number 6. Dr. Archana will give her a chance because we are on time. Dr. Archana, would you like to see if you can share your screen? Dr. Archana?
I'll try, sir.
Yeah. Okay, I think the problem is yet to get solved. We'll move ahead. Number 8, Challa Hemalata, doctor. Are you ready?
Sir, I'm ready. Sir. Is my slide being visible?
No. Okay. No, Dr. Archana, please hold on. We'll try last. Okay. Now we'll try last.
Okay, sir.
Dr. Challa Hemalata.
Yes, sir.
Yes, please try and share your screen.
Okay, sir.
Yes,
Sir,
perfect. Yes. Slideshow.
Okay, sir.
Perfect. Please proceed.
Yeah. Good evening to everyone. Myself is Challa Hemalata. My topic is comparative study of maternal and fetal outcome in a pregnant woman with and without fibroids after 37 weeks of pregnancy. Myomas are benign smooth muscle tumors of uterus. Its incidence is 10 to 40% in women reproductive age group. It may increase in size, or it regress, or it unchanged during pregnancy. It causes maternal problems and neonatal outcome problems. In maternal problems during antenatal period, it is antepartum hemorrhage, red degeneration of fibroid, and malpositions, malpresentation, PROM, IUGR, placenta, and intrapartum it causes obstructed labor, increased risk of cesarean delivery, and retained placenta and postpartum hemorrhage. Neonatal outcome it include low birth weight, respiratory distress, low ABGAR, NICU admission, and TTN, and perinatal morbidity and mortality. My study primary objective is to study and compare the fetal outcome in a pregnant woman and with or without fibroids after 37 weeks of pregnancy who are attending labor room for delivery. Secondary objective is to study and compare the maternal outcome in a pregnant woman with and without fibroids after 37 weeks of pregnancy who are attending labor room. My thesis hypothesis is null hypothesis is the rate of NICU admission of newborn in women with fibroid uterus and is comparable with rate of NICU admission in newborn in those women without fibroid uterus. Alternative hypothesis is the rate of NICU admission of the newborn in women with fibroid uterus after 37 weeks of pregnancy is significantly more as compared to without fibroid uterus in pregnancy. Study site is Department of OBG, Cosmopolitan Hospital, Trivandrum. Study population is all antenatal women attending labor room with fibroid complicating pregnancy after 37 weeks of pregnancy taken as a cases, and without fibroid uterus after 37 weeks of pregnancy taken as a cases. Study design is comparative prospective study. Sample size is total 196, 98 is including as a cases, 98 is with controls. Study was conducted from June 2018 to June 2020. Samples are selected based on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria is all antenatal women attending labor room with fibroid uterus after 37 weeks of gestation. Exclusion criteria with multiple gestation and unbooked case. With using this formula, I get sample size is total 196. Each cases is 98 and control is 98. Methodology: samples are selected and informed consent is taken and reassured about confidentiality, and detailed history is taken. Detail and pelvic examination is done. Those with fibroid uterus is placed in group A, and those without fibroid uterus were placed in group B. Total sample size is 196. Outcome variables are maternal and fetal outcome. Maternal is over diabetes, chronic hypertension, gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, and cesarean sections, and complication in labor during myomectomy, and PPH and blood transfusion. And fetal are low birth weight and low Apgar and respiratory distress, MSAF and NICU admission, and perinatal morbidity and mortality. Independent variables are locality and religion. My study observation is age distribution: 15.3% cases and 3.1 controls were more than 35 years of age. This observation includes fibroids are more common after 35 years of age. The difference was statistically significant. And body mass index: 49% women in the fibroid group and 37.8% control had BMI is overweight. But the study is comparable, but the difference was not statistically significant. Gravida: 61.2% women in cases and 50% women in control were primary gravida. It is comparable, but the difference was not statistically significant. Size of the fibroid: 86.7% had fibroid size less than or equal to 5 centimeter, and 13.3% has fibroid size more than 5 centimeter. Most of the fibroids in my study is less than or equal to 5 centimeter. Number of fibroids: 81 women has single fibroid and 17 had multiple fibroids. My study has most of them has single fibroid compared to multiple fibroids. In my study, 59.2% women has fibroid on the anterior wall of the uterus compared to other sites. Type of 76 women had subserosal fibroid and 25 has intramural fibroid, and 2 women had cervical and 1 woman has submucosal fibroid. In my study, most of the women has subserosal fibroid. Mode of the delivery: in cases, 50% underwent LSCS with myomectomy, 23.5% has LSCS without myomectomy, and 26.5% has cases as vaginal delivery. In the control group, 49.6% underwent LSCS, and other things are have normal vaginal delivery. In my observation, that is in cases, most of the women underwent LSCS with myomectomy and greater number of cesarean section in cases compared to controls. This was statistically significant. 82.6% women has single myomectomy and 17.4% has multiple myomectomy. PPH: 22 women in cases and 4 women in controls have mild PPH, and 4 women in cases as moderate PPH. This inferring fibroids are likely to have PPH more than control. This is statistically significant. Transfusion: 10 women in cases has 1 PRBC transfusion, and 1 woman in cases has 2 PRBC transfusion, and none of the control require PRBS transfusion, and 3 women in cases has a parental iron injection. This infer that fibroids need PRBC transfusion and parental iron injection after delivery compared to controls due to atonic PPH. This is statistically significant. Birth weight of the neonate: 56 women in cases and 36 women in control group delivered babies with birth weight less than 3 kg.
One more minute, please.
This infer that fibroids are likely to have a small weight babies compared to control. This is statistically significant. My study conclusion is women with fibroids were aged more than 35 years. Overweight women have more chances of fibroid. In my study, single fibroid, subserosal type, and an anterior wall of the uterus and size less than or equal to 5 centimeter. Women with fibroid have more cesarean delivery compared to controls. PPH and need of blood transfusion more in the fibroid group compared to the controls. Birth weight of babies born to women with fibroid uterus was less than 3 kg. Implication of the study: women who are low parity primary gravida age more than 30 years have more chance of fibroid. That way we should be counseled regarding the regular antenatal checkups and early conception and antenatal complication. Women who are overweight tend to have more chance of fibroid. That way we have to advise the weight reduction. Women with fibroid have more chance of PPH and more blood loss during delivery, and there is a need of blood transfusion. That way we have to counsel regarding the blood transfusion and complications. And the delivery should be taken in a tertiary care center where blood bank facilities should be available and good theater facilities should be available. Thank you, madam.
Thank you. I request the judges for discussion questions.
Hemlata,
Yes, ma'am.
your study, 86% of your women had fibroids that were fairly small, isn't it?
Yeah, madam, less than or
You think that their fibroids contributed to their cesareans?
no, madam. Most they are incidental finding during cesarean section.
I see. Okay. So they were incidental findings. So then you had put them in the group of fibroids. So you have found them earlier, isn't it?
Yeah, madam. During first early pregnancy ultrasonography, we found it. We found it during early ultrasonography, madam.
But so they were not incidental. How
Yeah,
many did you actually see at usually at delivery? Sometimes you don't even see these less than 5 centimeters.
Yeah.
Did you actually see all the fibroids that you had seen antenatally?
No, madam. Only we can see 50%. 50% of them are regress during.
And your cesarean sections, your PPH was contributed by the myomectomy or was it by the fibroid?
Maybe it's myomectomy, and also with atonic PPH is also one of the cause for the.
No, have you looked at atonic PPH separately, or is it only the myomectomy group which had the PPH?
No, sir. Compared to the fibroid group, has more atonic PPH compared to the control, sir.
Yeah, agreed. But those patients who underwent myomectomy who had PPH, or the other ones which with fibroid had atonic PPH also?
I didn't look separately, sir. I looked into the fibroid group and non-fibroid group, sir.
Okay, thank you, judges, and thank you, Dr. Chella Hemlata. At this point, I wish to hand over. Dr. Reggie is back. Dr. Reggie, can you put your video?
Yeah, thank you, Venu. Thank you, Venu. Thank you very much for helping me.
Yeah, no, Reggie, I want to just remind you of one thing. Number 6, Dr. Archana has not been able to share her screen. So as matter of policy and what we decided, she will be presenting last. So you can continue next with Dr. Divya Vishnu.
Okay, Divya Vishnu, you can come on screen. You can share your presentation. Divya, are you there?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Please start sharing your screen. Start sharing your screen.
Okay, sir. Slide.
5 minutes, I will be stopping you. 6 minutes is the total and 2 minutes for interaction.
Respected judges, can I start, sir?
Yes,
please.
Respected judges and my dear friends, a very good evening to all. I am Dr. Divya Vishnu, gynecologist, Rajagiri Hospital, Alva. My study is a prospective study on intrapartum management of twin delivery in a tertiary care center. I'll be discussing the background, aim, materials and methodology, and results of the study, and finally the conclusion. Twin pregnancies account for 0.5 to 2% of all gestation worldwide. In our setting, it is around 2.4%. With the advent of artificial reproductive technology, higher order pregnancies are increasing. Therefore, we need expertise in the intrapartum management of twin deliveries. Although ACOG and RCOG recommends vaginal delivery for twins if the first of twins is cephalic, many centers still follow planned cesarean if the second of twins is non-cephalic. The reason being uncertainty regarding the presentation of the second twin after the delivery of first twin. Studies show that there is 4 to 10% risk of cesarean for the second of the twins after the vaginal delivery of first twin. With active management of twin delivery, this risk can be reduced. Study done by Nathan S. Forbes in 2010 says, planned delivery of twin pregnancies seems to be associated with neonatal outcomes similar to those with planned cesarean delivery. Study done by Gerhard Bogner says, spontaneous vaginal delivery after 32nd week is safe when first twin is cephalic presentation. Study done by Marta Benito et al. In 2019 says, as inter-twin delivery interval increases, there is increased risk of poor Apgar and decreased cord pH. Aim of my study is to analyze the mode of delivery in twin gestation and to analyze intrapartum management of delivery of second of twin. Coming to materials and methods, my study design is a prospective observational study in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Rajagiri Hospital, Alva. And my study period was from 2017 May to March 2021. And I included all twin pregnancies more than 24 weeks attending Rajagiri Hospital, Alva. Coming to materials and methodology, our protocol is like planned induction of delivery for both DCD and MCDA twins reaching term if the first twin is cephalic, considering other obstetric parameters. After the delivery of the first twin, lie of the second baby will be assessed and confirmed with ultrasound. An attempt will be made to make the lie of the second baby longitudinal if it is transverse. Against the conventional thoughts like waiting for the spontaneous onset of contraction for the delivery of the second of twin, we follow active management of twin delivery. Therefore, we can see from the slides, inter-twin delivery interval in our setting is very less. There were 114 twins more than 24 weeks during my study period, of which 65.79% were DCDA and 33.3% was MCDA and 0.87% was MCMA. Of the 114 twins, 28% delivered at less than 34 weeks and 72% delivered at more than or equal to 34 weeks. Now, coming to the mode of delivery, out of 114 twins, 57 could achieve vaginal delivery, which constitutes 50%, and 56 had to undergo LSCS, which constitutes 49%. And for one twin, first baby was delivered vaginally, and LSCS was done for second of the baby, which constitutes 0.8%. Now coming to the indication for LSCS in twins, 7 were done for previous years and 13 were for first baby non-cephalic and 1 was for MCMA twins, and one of the twins had history of previous laparoscopic myomectomy, and 5 of the twins had selective growth restriction, and 2 were having placenta previa, and 1 had abruption and 1 had uterine rupture. In short, excluding those pregnancies who had previous uterine surgeries, 62% of the twins with first baby cephalic presentation had vaginal delivery. Now coming to the outcome of twin induction, during my study period, 40 twins were induced, out of which 27 could achieve vaginal delivery, which constitutes 67.5%, which reaches up to international standard. And
Divya, 1 more minute.
12 had underwent LSCS and 1 had vaginal delivery for the first twin and LSCS for the second baby. Now coming to the inter-twin delivery interval, out of the 57 twins delivered vaginally, 55 had inter-twin delivery interval less than 15 minutes and 2 had more than 15 minutes. This decrease in inter-twin delivery interval, which we attribute to the active management of twin delivery, which we practice here. And now coming to the mode of delivery of the second of twin, 4 were delivered by IPV, 6 were delivered by assisted breech delivery, 1 was delivered by breech extraction, and 25 of the second of twins were delivered by instrumental delivery and 22 by vaginal delivery. In conclusion, presentation of second of twin does not affect the plan of mode of delivery, and with proper planning of the delivery of the twins, cesarean rate in twins can be reduced. Active management of the twin delivery, which we do recommend, helps to reduce inter-twin delivery interval, thereby improving neonatal outcome. It also helps to reduce the incidence of cesarean for second of twin.
Thank you, Divya.
Thank you.
Madams?
Divya?
Yes.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Divya, you've included groups right from 24 weeks onwards.
Yes, sir.
You could have segregated, because what outcome in very early gestation, that is between 24 to 30 weeks and 30 weeks and beyond and closer towards term, may not be the same. So if you do you have data on these segregated portions, because your outcomes will be grossly different depending upon the gestational age and your intervention also. So have you looked at that data?
Sir, I have included all the twins more than 24 weeks because WHO criteria viability is like more than 24 weeks. And regarding the mode of delivery, actually all twin inductions were done at more than 34 weeks. So in that 67.5% could achieve vaginal delivery. And in that data, it's like more than 34 weeks were involved. The other data which I included all the twins.
Okay, so your outcomes will not be the same. So that's why your study relevance becomes a little less, because your period of gestation, if you could have segregated it, would have been much more better. I mean, you can still do it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the same thing I also wanted to know, that your preterms, your extreme preterms would have contributed to your cesarean section rates.
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So, and did you study the baby outcomes?
Baby outcomes were studied. Most of the babies had to go to the NICU for observation, and most of the and all the babies who were more than 34 weeks had good outcome, and less than 34 weeks. It was like some of the babies had sequelae.
Madam, time. Divya, you can close the presentation. You can close the presentation, Divya.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Shall we go on to the next, madam?
Yeah, yeah.
Stop screen sharing. Yeah. Hira, Dr. Hira is there. Dr. Hira Shenoy.
Just a minute. There's an Emmy. 1 minute. Hira, just a minute. Emmy.
No. That's the old one. Emmy is tomorrow.
Oh, okay. All right.
Dr.
This is
Hira.
right.
Dr. Hira, you can start.
Hear me?
Share the screen.
Yes, it is. I'm screen sharing.
Yeah. You have 6 minutes plus 2 minutes.
Thank you so
5
much.
minutes, I'll be interrupting.
Thank you, Ekyo Soji, for this opportunity. Respected teachers, seniors, and my colleagues. My topic is on postnatal depression and perceived stress in mothers, and what are the lessons I have learned.
Show, please.
Please make it slideshow.
In the sense, make it a slideshow.
Slideshow, please.
Yes.
Super.
Is it okay? Thank you so much. So depression and stress together during pregnancy can lead to serious adverse outcomes on the mother, her fetus, and the newborn. It could lead to low birth weight, preterm births, and fetal growth restriction. The sequelae could be suicides and infanticides, which we will regret later. So in 2017, Government of Kerala had launched Amma Manasa, which was an initiative to address the psychiatric disorders among women during pregnancy and post-delivery. Kerala is one of the pioneer states in which confidential review of maternal deaths is carried out, and in 2018-19, maternal suicides contributed around 7%, and hence it was my wish to conduct this study. So what is this study about? This study was done, it's a cross-sectional study done at Travancore Medical College, Kollam during the time period 2018 December to 2019 March. The aim of the study was to assess the severity and prevalence of both depression and stress among postnatal women and the determinants of these both. Determinants which were studied were socio-demographic, obstetric, family dynamics, neonatal, and psychiatric determinants. The participants were 119 in their postpartum state up to 6 weeks, and the ethics committee approval was obtained. The informed written consent in the local language was taken, and patients who were not willing, mothers who were not willing for the study were excluded. And the tools we used were EPDS, Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, to screen the depressive symptoms, and an EPDS score cutoff of 13 and more. On Malayalam version, it was validated and used for this study. The maternal stress was assessed by 10-item PSS, Perceived Stress Scale, by Sheldon Cohen. The cutoffs which were used, the cases were EPDS more than 13, both EPDS more than 13, and perceived stress scale more than 14 were taken as the cases, and the remaining both were taken as the controls. This is the Malayalam version of EPDS, which I used in the study, which was validated by Dr. Arun B. Nair from Government Medical College, Trivandrum. And the PSS 10 Malayalam questionnaire was this. So the variables which were studied were the maternal determinants. These included the maternal age, the maternal education, father's age was also taken, I have not put in the slide, socioeconomic status, whether the pregnancy was planned or not. All these 5 variables did not achieve any statistical significance in this present research. The next determinants which were studied were the obstetric determinants, which was the gestational age of delivery and the mode of delivery. Both of these, that is, the patients who had both postnatal stress and depression, delivered 1.17 weeks earlier in mothers than without both. And the cesarean section was more in both these groups. Coming to the family dynamics, which is the most important thing, adolescent mothers contributed to the bulk of the postnatal stress and depression. Those patients who fell in love and got married without the support of their parents and in-laws and had no social support, and the poor self-esteem at the time of conception succumbed to postnatal depression and stress in this study. And all these variables came to be except social support, came to be statistically significant. Gender issues, as you all know, throughout in India and Tamil Nadu and various other states, where gender issues have been an important determinant, was not seen in our study, probably because of the matriarchal society and no gender bias which is seen. Gender fear and gender bias was not seen. Childcare stress contributed to postnatal depression, as said by Beck et al. Coming to the major factors, psychological determinants, the personal history of depression and psychiatric illness in the family had a significant odds of developing postnatal depression, and it is the viewpoint to counsel and to see the at-risk mothers who are at risk of developing PND from their history itself. This is just a comparison group of both the insignificant variables. So what are the lessons I have learned or we have learned in this study? So those who have married young, those who fell in love and got, that's not a fault, but they should be provided support systems. Gestational age at birth and cesarean deliveries were significant determinants. Gender of the newborn, fear and preference towards any particular gender, and order of female child in multiparous women had no association in this study. Methods with childcare stress, family and personal history of depression, as well as psychiatric illness evident in the family had significant odds of developing postnatal depression and stress and both. So the recommendations I would like to put across would be to counsel mothers, either pre-pregnant, those who are planning to conceive, you can start from there. And during the antenatal period, the second trimester and third trimester, as long as we have our antenatal visits, it would be better to have a few minutes time on talking to her and being an ear to her, listening what her issues are. And this could go a long way in preventing suicides, which is very important, which is going to be it's a direct cause of maternal mortality according to ICD-10 classification, 2012 group. Preventive strategy could be to initiate a plan to mental health strategy program at various levels, and the policy implications is to ensure that there is equity of resources to serve both the physical and mental health needs of the mothers. And we have to provide, there are antenatal clinics, but we should take keen interest in maintaining them and having them on an everyday basis and providing healthy counseling to every mother, infant duo, so that both have an excellent opportunity to thrive. That's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hira, for finishing on time. Judges, please.
Hira, you had 115 patients, isn't it?
119, ma'am.
119. And how many of them did you actually find any form of stress? And I didn't get your methodology.
Madam, stress was, I had done these two papers separately and then done both together. Actually, when I looked into postnatal depression alone, 35 of them had EPDs more than 13.
35?
Yes. 35.
115.
Yes, ma'am. 119. I did a personal 1:1 counseling and a session with 15 minutes I spent with each patient. So I found that patients were significantly, there was 35 of 119, but stress was much higher. Stress came to around 60 out of 119. That is moderate and severe stress, not mild.
My moderate was 60.
Moderate plus severe came to 60.
So you said in your recommendations that these women must be identified.
we should identify them by either we should talk to them regarding that. Many of them will not open up. Actually, when we spend more time and when we talk to them, few of them will open up and they won't say about spouse violence. They're not clear cut. They're not opening up and they just fear.
So what were the parameters of stress that you got? How did you?
That's the questionnaire, which was PSS 10 questionnaire.
Can you tell me 2-3 points?
Yes, ma'am. The stress was that if they come across a sudden situation in which they have to handle, will they be able to handle it alone? Second is that, do you think that you can control things happening in your life? That is the English version. Then have you felt stress, pirimurukam? Have you felt sangarshangal and pirimurukam at any point during the last 1 month of your antenatal period, third trimester? Then do you think any obstacles are there in your way? Or can you control your temper? Control your temper. And do you think?
Did you look at depression? No.
Yes, ma'am. Depression is not in this scale. That was EPDS. This is stress. I've done both separately and then club. With the help of a psychiatrist, Arun. I had taken the help of Arun for this validation.
Okay. Which trimester?
Same group of patients? Same group of patients you have taken?
Yes. All was 119. Same patients.
Same patients. And so I don't know whether I missed something there, but did you screen these patients in the antenatal period or only?
No. I had the thought in the antenatal period. I didn't do it. I should have done it in 36 weeks. That would have been a better health. I should do one more. I feel. Yeah, I'm short of that. I need one more, sir. Next week is CUG. I'll present it.
More relevant. You could do that.
Yes, sir. It's correct.
Thank you, judges. I think you can stop your screen. Now I invite Dr. Jean Joseph. Are you ready, Jean?
Yes, sir.
You have 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 5 minutes. I will be warning you.
Yes, sir. Good evening, judges. I am Dr. Jean Joseph from Amala Institute of Medical Sciences, Thrissur. And my topic for the paper is role of use of low molecular weight heparin in COVID-positive antenatal mothers. Okay, so since pregnancy is a hypocoagulable state and COVID-19 infection is shown to cause thromboembolic complications, this is a topic, that's why I took the topic. The thromboprophylaxis in COVID-positive antenatal mothers has always been a controversial subject and not much study has been done on this. So that is why I took this topic. To prove that use of low molecular weight heparin in COVID-positive antenatal mothers and whether it is associated with reduction in D-dimer levels and decreased complications in terms of ICU admission. All the COVID-positive antenatal mothers admitted in the hospital whose D-dimer values were available were included in my study. And methodology, it is a retrospective study on 30 COVID-positive antenatal mothers admitted in our hospital. And D-dimer levels were monitored before and after starting low molecular weight heparin. And it was given as per standard rules, that is 40 milligram subcutaneous OD for a period of 10 days. The complications were monitored in terms of need for ICU admission. So in my study, majority of the women belong to the age group of 26 to 30 years. That is, out of 30 women who were COVID positive and underwent treatment, 14 belong to the age group of 26 to 30 years. And 15 were primigravidas and the other 15 were multigravidas. Now, most of them, majority, that is 30 people, 30 women belong to category B based on the COVID-19 infection criteria. And the D-dimer levels after starting low molecular weight heparin, about 25 cases were shown to decrease. Decreased D-dimer values were noted. There were 2 cases in which the D-dimer levels were shown to increase even after starting low molecular weight heparin. And for 3 cases, only a single value of D-dimer was available. So those were not available for comparison. So depending on the complications, there were none patients who needed ICU admissions due to complications, and all of them required ward admission for 8 days, and after being RAT negative, they were discharged.
So summing up the results, out of 30 antenatal cases, COVID positive, 14 belong to the age group of 26 to 30 years, and 50% were primary gravida. All the women belong to category B at the time of admission, and 25 women, that is 83.33%, showed reduction in D-dimer values after starting low molecular weight heparin. 2 showed an increase in D-dimer levels even though low molecular weight heparin was started, and 3 women had only 1 value of D-dimer whose further values were not available for comparison. And none of the antenatal mothers who were started on low molecular weight heparin needed ICU admission. So a similar study was performed by Koyunsu K et al., which also showed that use of low molecular weight heparin had shown to reduce complications in the COVID positive antenatal mothers. They had actually studied 18 antenatal mothers COVID positive, out of which 11 showed a decrease in the complications, but they were not monitored seriously with D-dimer levels. So in conclusion, the use of low molecular weight heparin in COVID positive antenatal mothers is beneficial in lowering D-dimer levels, and it has also been found to reduce complications in terms of need for ICU admission. These are the references. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question? Do you think there's any flaw in your study? Have you relied on D-dimer a bit much?
Usually, there is no other way to materialize what I am saying, because everyone knows that pregnancy is a thromboprophylactic, increased risk for thrombotic events, but there is no sufficient data to prove that low molecular weight heparin is beneficial. So that is why to quantitate that, D-dimer levels have been used.
What was your fall? What was the majority of your fall? But with what kind of levels of D-dimer? Because D-dimer in pregnancy is basically, I agree, we all followed this in the COVID times, but D-dimer in pregnancy is not very efficient as a screening method. So what kind of fall did you see? What were your initial values?
Ma'am, there is no clear cutoff that could be available. It was only a range that I could get, that is about 730 microgram per ml to about 10,000 microgram per ml. Those were the ranges which I got, and when I looked into data also, it varies according to the period of gestation also, and even antenatally as well as postpartum, the values were found to be varying.
So after heparin, now let's presume that D-dimer is a marker for thrombosis in pregnancy, which it may not be, but after you gave heparin, how much did it really come down by?
Ma'am, most of them at term, those who delivered, there were only 13 cases who delivered, and I had got postpartum results as well. So postpartum, although there might be a small increase noted, about 500 microgram per ml were found to be reduced when low molecular weight heparin was introduced.
How many times did you do the D-dimer?
Ma'am, every alternate day.
Till they became RAT negative?
Yes, ma'am.
And your two that started increasing, did they fare badly or did they fare okay?
Ma'am, they did not require any ICU admission as such, but maybe because of some delay in getting the sample to the lab or due to some technical reasons, probably that might have also influenced in the results, I think. Because if the blood sample that is obtained for D-dimer assay is taken for a longer time, it has been shown to cause elevated levels.
All your women got low molecular weight heparin and they got 0.4.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you increase the heparin when the D-dimer started rising in these two women?
No, ma'am.
I was just curious.
Thank you, madam. Thank you. Shall we go on to the next candidate?
Yeah.
Jean, please stop your screen. Ramya, are you there? Ramya Santana? Ramya?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, start.
Okay, sir.
Start your screen. Share it.
Is my screen visible, sir?
Yeah, it's visible. You can make it full screen from beginning. Yeah, good.
Yes, sir. Can I start, sir?
Please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, respected judges and panel member. Thanks for the excellent opportunity. I'm Ramya. I've done my MS from Kottayam Medical College and FNB from Edapal. My topic is CRL discrepancy as a predictor for adverse perinatal outcome in dichorionic pregnancies. Pregnancies are increasing. This is because of the increased advancements in the field of assisted reproductive technology, and twins contribute to a significant proportion of neonatal and perinatal morbidity and mortality. On one side, the twin pregnancies is increasing. On the other side, there are a number of studies going on to find out the predictors for adverse outcome in twin pregnancies. And the best and the first predictor is the chorionicity, because it is the chorionicity which will decide the management in twin pregnancy rather than zygosity. In my study, I wanted to know whether the CRL discrepancy in first trimester could be used as a predictor for adverse perinatal outcome in dichorionic pregnancies. Coming to the studies done before, this CRL discrepancies association with adverse perinatal outcome has been a matter of controversy. Some studies say that there is a positive association, and some studies could not find association between CRL discrepancy and adverse outcome. Keeping in this, these things in mind, my study idea was to find out whether the CRL discrepancy was associated with outcomes like pregnancy loss before viability, structural abnormalities, IUGR in one or both the twins, significant birth weight discordance of more than 20% between the twins. It was a prospective study conducted in the Edapal Hospital over a period of 2 years. We included antenatal patients with dichorionic pregnancies who had ultrasound follow-up and delivery at our center. We excluded DCDA twins with one miscarriage, monochorionic pregnancies, higher order multiple pregnancies, and those who were referred or lost to follow-up. And these twin pregnancies undergoing first trimester ultrasound at our hospital satisfying the inclusion criteria were taken into the study. Ultrasound was by FMF certified doctors. CRL was measured as per ISOG recommendation. CRL discrepancy was calculated. CRL discrepancy of more than 10% was considered as significant. And keeping this significant discrepancy, we categorize the DCDA twins into two groups: those with significant CRL discrepancy and those without CRL discrepancy. And all these pregnancies were followed up with monthly ultrasound and examination. During follow-up ultrasound, structural anatomical survey was done to rule out structural abnormality, and biometry was assessed in each visit to look for IUGR development in one or both the twins. And birth weight discordance was measured. Delivery was planned in uncomplicated group between 37 to 38 weeks. And in complicated group, depending upon the stage of the IUGR, the delivery was planned, and after delivery, the actual birth weight discordance was measured, and these babies were followed up for 28 days. Totally, we had 195 dichorionic pregnancies, of which 45% of them had significant CRL discrepancy of more than 10%, and 70% of our study population were ICSI conception, and only 30% was non-ICSI conception. And it was found that the CRL discrepancy was more in the ICSI group compared to the non-ICSI group. Pregnancy loss before viability was seen in 20% in the CRL discordant group compared to only 9% in the non-discordant group. And structural abnormality was observed only in the discordant group. And there were 7 babies with structural abnormality. The structural abnormalities observed were anencephaly in 2, and the rest were like minor abnormalities like CTEV, hydronephrosis, and heart abnormalities. IUGR was categorized by based on Delphi consensus, and IUGR in one or both the twins was seen in 40% in the discordant group compared to only 10% in the non-discordant group. And preterm labor was also 2 times more in the discordant group compared to the non-discordant group. Actual birth weight discordance of more than 20% was considered as significant in our study. ACOG says the discordance, when the discordance is between 15 to 25%, it is significant. We have taken 20%. And it was observed that 60% of the discordant group had a significant birth weight discordance compared to only 9% in the non-discordant group. So from our study, we could find that 45% had a significant CRL discrepancy, and most of our pregnancies were ICSI conception, and CRL discrepancy was also more in the ICSI group compared to the non-ICSI group. And all the complications, pregnancy loss before viability, structural abnormality, IUGR, actual birth weight discordance, preterm labor were statistically significantly associated with CRL discrepancy compared to the non-discordant group. But the neonatal outcome, the neonatal morbidity and mortality, there was no statistical significant association between the CRL discrepant and non-discrepant group. To conclude, the CRL discrepancy could be used as a predictor in first trimester. It will help us in categorizing the DCDA twins into two groups, those with CRL discrepancy and those without CRL discrepancy. And this will help us in having a watchful surveillance in the discordant group, where we can do an early anatomical survey to rule out structural abnormality, and biometry and estimated fetal weight discordance at each visit can be done monthly to see for the development of IUGR in the discordant group. And this watchful surveillance will help us in finding out the IUGR or significant birth weight discordance in the discordant group. And then the surveillance can be changed according to the stage of the IUGR, and we can time the delivery appropriately, and all these will improve the perinatal outcome. Our study limitations was the sample size was small, and we did not include twins with one miscarriage before 11 weeks. And 70% of our conception were ICSI conception. These are my references. I thank my guide and co-guide for their support throughout the study, and thanks one and all for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ramya.
Doctor, you had only ICSI conceptions, or do you have natural conception also in your group?
Yes, sir. 70% of our DCDA pregnancy was ICSI conception. We had spontaneous conception also, sir. The non-ICSI group included spontaneous conception, ovulation induction, and IUI conception, sir.
Okay. Ramya, please switch on your video. We want to see you.
1 minute, ma'am.
So, have you looked at change in among ICSI group and the spontaneous conception group? Have you looked at that, or was there any difference, or have you not looked at it?
No, sir. We just looked for the CRL discrepancy, and it was more in the ICSI group compared to the non-ICSI group. We did not have a comparison between the ICSI and non-ICSI groups, sir.
Okay. What about the data in the other studies? Are they similar to yours?
There are so many studies which says that CRL discrepancy is not associated with adverse perinatal outcome, and there are few studies which say significant association. But the study design and collection was almost same in all the studies, sir. They have categorized the twins into two groups, and they have looked for these complications.
Has the same operator performed all the scans?
No, ma'am. We had 3 doctors, but all of them were FMF certified. They are not, I mean, it was not performed by a single doctor.
Your neonatal outcome was similar, isn't it?
There was no statistical significant association, sir. We had neonatal death of 1 baby in 8 cases, of which 3-4 were the discordant group and 4 were in the non-discordant group. There was no significant association in the neonatal death.
But your structural anomalies were more in the discordant.
Yes, it was seen only in the discordant group, ma'am.
That didn't, none of them, all of them, what kind of anomalies?
2 were anencephaly and 1 was neural tube defect. Rest all are like non-significant anomalies like CTEV and hydronephrosis and VST. Ma'am.
Shall we move on to the next, madam? So shall we call it a day, and we'll ask the Ambuja madam to give her concluding remarks? Let me thank the judges, Dr. Sangeeta madam, Dr. Haris Prasad sir, and Anuj sir for their active involvement and active questioning of the participants. I think it was fruitful. Tomorrow again, another 21 candidates are there. I think I invite Dr. Ambuja madam to say the concluding remarks and regarding today's presentations.
Anyway, I am happy to note that the participants, we had an overwhelming response from the participants, and we had to keep one more day for the papers, and that means how much involved our youngsters and members are. Very happy to find that. Anyway, we had a very good variety of topics being included today. Everything went on well, and thank you so much, judges and the coordinators, for conducting the program, and it was ended up timely. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think all of us can leave here and join the cultural program in Hall 2.
Yeah, we have to go to Hall B. We have to leave this session and join the Hall B Thank you, Sangeeta madam. Thank you, Anuj sir, and thank you, Hari Krishna sir. Thank you, Ambuja madam. Thank you, Venu.
Okay, thank
you, Medcon people. Thank you. We will meet tomorrow.